What happens when a federal judge starts asking questions that the government can't simply brush aside? In Washington, that's exactly the situation unfolding in a courtroom where the Department of Justice is facing mounting pressure over its handling of records connected to Jeffrey Epstein. At the center of the dispute is Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, who was ordered to provide specific materials directly to the court after Judge Emmett Sullivan demanded a closer look at several disputed documents. While no contempt ruling has been issued, the judge's insistence on reviewing the evidence himself has intensified scrutiny over whether the government has fully complied with previous court orders. Could this become one of the most closely watched transparency battles involving the Justice Department this year? Let's break down exactly what's happening and why legal experts are paying such close attention. Welcome back. Today's story isn't about campaign rallies or political speeches. It's about a courtroom, because sometimes the most significant political developments don't happen in front of cheering crowds. They happen inside federal court, where every filing, every deadline, and every judicial order carries real legal consequences. The dispute began after journalist Katie Fang filed litigation seeking additional disclosure of records connected to the government's handling of materials associated with Jeffrey Epstein. According to court filings discussed in the source material you shared, Judge Sullivan had already ordered the government to provide certain information and later required specific documents to be submitted for his private review, known legally as an in-camera inspection. The court's focus is narrow but significant. Rather than immediately deciding broader questions about compliance, the judge first requested several identified documents so he could personally determine whether the government's explanations justified withholding or redacting information. Meanwhile, other unresolved issues remain pending, including questions about untranslated foreign language documents and whether the Department of Justice adequately documented thousands of redactions through a privilege log. Those broader compliance questions have not yet been resolved by the court. Supporters of greater disclosure argue that the public deserves transparency. Government lawyers maintain that some materials involve victims whose privacy rights require continued protection. That tension between public access and protecting victims is becoming one of the defining legal questions in this case. And as Judge Sullivan reviews the submissions now before him, every new filing is being closely watched for clues about what could happen next. So why did Judge Sullivan decide that simply reading the government's explanations wasn't enough? The answer goes to the heart of how federal courts evaluate disputes over government transparency. Instead of accepting written descriptions of the disputed records, the judge ordered several specific documents to be delivered directly to his chambers for an in-camera review, meaning he would examine them privately before deciding whether they should remain withheld or be disclosed in some form. According to the source material, the government met the deadline by submitting the requested materials shortly before the court's cutoff. That procedural step is significant because it shows the court wants to independently verify the government's claims rather than rely solely on legal arguments. The documents reportedly include several emails and investigative records that the government argues involve individuals it identifies as victims or potential victims. Because of those privacy concerns, officials have maintained that some names and identifying details should remain protected. But that's only one piece of the case. Judge Sullivan is also considering whether the Department of Justice has fully complied with earlier court directives. One issue involves a large collection of foreign language documents. Another concerns whether the government properly documented extensive redactions through a privilege or redaction log. Those compliance questions remain unresolved and separate from the judge's immediate review of the specific records already submitted. Legal analysts often point out that when judges begin asking for the underlying documents themselves, it can signal they want to carefully test the factual basis behind the parties' positions before issuing a ruling. That doesn't necessarily predict the outcome. The judge could agree with the government's explanations. He could order additional disclosures, or he could require further briefing before making any final decision. At this stage, none of those outcomes has been announced. Meanwhile, another important development has complicated the case even further. A woman identified in court only as Jane Doe asked to intervene, arguing that releasing certain identifying information could expose her to renewed trauma. Her attorneys contend that documents viewed without proper context could unfairly suggest she willingly participated in conduct when, according to the filing, she was actually a victim of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse. That request highlights the difficult balance the court must strike. On one hand, there is a strong public interest in transparency surrounding high-profile government records. On the other, federal courts also have a responsibility to protect victims whose identities or personal histories could be exposed unnecessarily. As Judge Sullivan weighs those competing interests, the next round of decisions could shape not only this case, but also broader expectations about how sensitive government records are handled in future litigation. While much of the attention has focused on the documents now sitting on Judge Sullivan's desk, legal observers say the bigger story may actually involve the issues that haven't been resolved yet. Those outstanding questions could determine whether the Department of Justice fully complied with the court's previous directives or whether additional action will be required before this case moves forward. One major issue involves thousands of pages of foreign language materials connected to the broader Epstein investigation. According to the arguments discussed in the source material, critics say those documents should have been translated before decisions were made about whether they could be withheld or released. They argue that reviewing documents without knowing exactly what they contain raises concerns about whether the government's review process was complete. Another unresolved dispute centers on what's known as a privilege log. In federal litigation, when documents are withheld or heavily redacted, parties are often expected to provide a log explaining why particular materials were not produced. That process allows both the opposing party and the court to evaluate whether the claimed exemptions are legally justified. Here, critics contend that such documentation has not been produced in the form they believe the court expected. The government, meanwhile, has defended its handling of the records, arguing that victim privacy and other legal considerations remain central to its decisions. These may sound like technical procedural disputes, but in federal court, procedural compliance often matters just as much as the underlying evidence. Judges rely on deadlines, disclosure requirements, and detailed explanations to ensure every party follows the same rules. If a court concludes that required procedures were not followed, it has a range of options available, from ordering additional production to imposing sanctions in appropriate circumstances. Importantly, no contempt finding has been issued in this case. While commentators have speculated about what the judge might do next, the court has not yet announced such a decision. As the judge reviews both the submitted documents and the broader compliance questions, every filing now carries added significance. At the same time, another filing reminded the court that transparency is only one side of this legal battle. A woman identified only as Jane Doe formally asked the court to protect her identity, arguing that releasing her name would add little to the public's understanding of the government's actions while exposing her to serious personal harm. According to her filing, documents viewed without context could create a misleading impression about someone she says was exploited as a victim. That request underscores the challenge facing Judge Sullivan. The court must balance two competing principles: the public's interest in government transparency and the legal system's obligation to protect victims from unnecessary harm. How that balance is struck could influence not only this litigation, but also future disputes involving sensitive investigative records. Now comes the question everyone is asking: what happens next? The answer depends entirely on what Judge Sullivan concludes after reviewing the materials submitted by the Department of Justice. Unlike a public hearing, an in-camera review allows the judge to examine sensitive records privately. Only after completing that review will the court determine whether the government's explanations are legally sufficient or whether additional disclosures are required. That's why this stage of the case is so important. The judge isn't relying solely on competing legal arguments anymore. He's looking at the documents himself. According to the filings discussed in the source material, the Department of Justice submitted the requested records by the court's deadline and argued that many involve individuals who are recognized as victims or whose identities deserve legal protection. That creates several possible paths forward. The first possibility is that Judge Sullivan concludes the government's explanations are legally sufficient. If that happens, some or all of the disputed redactions could remain in place, and the court could move on to addressing the remaining compliance issues separately. The second possibility is that the judge determines additional records or portions of those records should be released. If he believes certain redactions are broader than necessary, he could order the government to produce revised versions while still protecting legitimate victim information. A third possibility is that the court requests even more briefing before making a final decision. Federal judges frequently seek additional clarification when they believe the existing record isn't complete enough to support a final ruling. Notice something important. Every one of these possibilities follows ordinary federal court procedure. At this point, no final ruling has been issued, and the court has not announced whether any sanctions or contempt findings will occur. That's an important distinction because legal commentary often discusses potential outcomes, but predictions are not the same as judicial decisions. The judge's written orders, not outside commentary, will ultimately determine what happens next. Another factor making this case especially sensitive is the involvement of victims. One filing asks the court to ensure that identifying information remains protected, arguing that public disclosure could cause lasting harm without meaningfully improving public understanding of the government's conduct. Federal courts routinely weigh those concerns. Transparency is a core principle of the American judicial system, but so is protecting victims from unnecessary exposure. Judge Sullivan's challenge is to balance both interests while ensuring the Department of Justice fulfills whatever legal obligations the court determines apply. That balancing act is exactly why the judge has taken such a careful, document-by-document approach instead of issuing a quick decision. As Washington waits for the next court order, attorneys on both sides know that every sentence of the judge's opinion could shape the direction of the litigation. By now, it's clear this case is about more than a disagreement over a handful of documents. The broader question is how federal courts oversee government transparency when highly sensitive records are involved. Every administration, regardless of political party, faces situations where it must balance competing obligations. On one side is the public's right to understand how government decisions are made. On the other is the responsibility to protect victims, preserve ongoing legal interests where applicable, and comply with privacy laws. This case sits directly at that intersection. Supporters of greater disclosure argue that public confidence depends on the government fully explaining why records are withheld. They contend that when courts request additional information or conduct their own review of disputed documents, it reinforces accountability rather than undermining it. Government attorneys, however, maintain that some information cannot simply be released because it may reveal the identities of victims or expose deeply personal information unrelated to public oversight. Those arguments have become a central part of the litigation now before Judge Sullivan. One reason this dispute has drawn so much national attention is that it demonstrates how federal judges serve as independent reviewers when disagreements arise over government records. Instead of accepting either side's arguments at face value, the court examines the evidence, considers the applicable law, and issues written decisions explaining its reasoning. That process can take time. It often unfolds through multiple rounds of filings, responses, and court orders before a final resolution is reached. This is also why legal experts caution against jumping to conclusions based on headlines alone. A request for additional documents is not the same as a ruling against the government. Likewise, speculation about sanctions or contempt is not the same as an actual court order. The judge's written opinion will ultimately determine whether the Department of Justice met its legal obligations or whether further action is required. As of now, the court has not issued a contempt ruling. While some commentators have predicted that possibility, it remains only a prediction until the judge announces a decision. Whatever Judge Sullivan ultimately decides, his ruling is likely to be studied closely by lawyers, journalists, and government officials alike. It could clarify how agencies should handle future requests involving sensitive investigative records and what level of documentation courts expect when information is withheld from the public. In other words, this isn't just about one lawsuit. It's about defining the standards that may influence similar transparency disputes in the future. As this legal battle continues, one thing is certain. The next major development won't come from political speeches or social media posts. It will come from the federal courtroom. Judge Sullivan now has the disputed materials before him. He must weigh competing legal arguments, consider the privacy rights of alleged victims, evaluate the government's compliance with previous orders, and determine what happens next under the law. Whether the court ultimately orders additional disclosures, accepts the government's explanations, or takes another procedural step, the written ruling will provide the clearest picture yet of where this case is headed. We'll continue following every filing, every order, and every significant development as they happen. If you found this breakdown helpful and want straightforward coverage of major legal and political stories, make sure to subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and let us know what case you'd like us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.